Hi everyone. So unexpectedly entered the live. So we are heading our session with Azraf about how to use data for making decision and developing your product. And originally the speech named data informed iteration in product development. I think it's a very comprehensive topic, and let me put a little context here. We have some secret guest for today. It's a great person, found us in LinkedIn, and we've been really fascinated by how this person build an attitude. So Azraf Anwar, he is working at Asana. Me personally, I not prefer to use any issue tracker during the hackathon because I think that something should be dropped in the chat and that's it. But when we doing a big projects or projects like our platform, we for sure having a backlog of tickets. And Asana is the system that may help to streamline the development process, or to be honest, any production process. And Azraf is a data scientist there. He prepared the slides, and also it's very important to say that he completed a bachelor from Columbia University, master's from New York University, and he a lot works to product managers, designers, software development, and knows a lot on SDLC, software development lifecycle. So Azraf is a great person to listen to about his ideas on a data-driven decisioning. And I would like to welcome Azraf to the main scene. Hi, Azraf, glad to see you. Yeah. And, yeah. How did you find us?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually saw that you guys were like hosting this hackathon, and I was like very, very curious because I'm based here in New York, and I've worked with other startup founders and engineers here in New York. And I saw that the hackathon you'd organized for like Lisbon was kind of centered around the startup scene and culture inside of Portugal. So curious to learn more about Europe and wanted to be involved however I could.
That's awesome. Have you ever been to Lisbon?
I have once, yeah. It's been a couple of years at this point, but I remember I loved I loved everybody's attitude there. I feel like it was like a very nice, laid back city, a good place to kind of like relax, you know? Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's so cool. Well, you know, we have a red bridge, the same as in San Francisco, so that's why Lisbon is so startup atmosphere city. And okay, how long time are you working at Asana?
I've been at Asana for about like 2.5 years now at this point. I like joined them right after I graduated from like my program at NYU. And yeah, it's like I guess like I've been kind of like focused a little bit there in terms of like the data science process. So working with product managers and designers in terms of like iteration for the product. And the other thing that I think like kind of like drew me to the hackathon that you have here is also just I have experience working with other startup founders here inside of New York too, kind of like helping them out in terms of product ideation. And one of the things that I really like about hackathons is how you can use it as like a framing space to start building into like bigger and bigger ideas and companies. I think this is actually what you were presenting on / talking to Joao about earlier. Yeah, so I think it's like a perfect kind of like a build-up kind of thing there, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So I wanna make a kind of stupid thing, but anyways, let's try. Jira or Utrack?
Jira or Utrack? Oh, that's a good question. I think I'm more used to using Jira, I guess.
Okay, Jira or Rike?
I'd still say Jira, I'm sorry. I think that might just be like exposure kind of thing, yeah?
Yeah. Jira or Asana?
Asana, yeah, obviously. I think
Asana or Todoist?
I would say Asana, genuinely speaking. One of the great things about Asana is we actually use Asana extensively at Asana. And it's like, if you leverage Asana, I think like it's like a really good way to keep yourself on top of everything that you need to do. So I actually have like a personal instance of Asana that I kind of like keep running on like my own phone to just kind of track through everything I've got to do, you know? Yeah.
May LXTHON as a project have a little discount on Asana if I tell Asana 5 more times during this live?
No comments on that one, I think.
Okay. But to be honest, yeah, we work closely to Asana. We have Asana special startup program from our incubator in Build Up Labs, and we use Asana in one of our projects. So actually, it's a great tool. And I would like to be a little bit more serious. So I just was wondering, you connected with SDLC, and for me, SDLC is about like plenty of metrics that can be counted about the Scrum process. Let's take Scrum. It's not only about a burn down diagram that everyone mentioned from the first lines, but also it's about defects ratio, it's a velocity, it's a capacity, it's maybe what it can be. Any other metrics? What metrics you also count in?
Yeah. I think so SDLC, I think like it's like a macrocosm of like the greater product development lifecycle, so PDLC, right? And I think like you hit it right on the head. SDLC, usually you kind of want to organize into like manageable short-term sprints. So you're either operating on like a weekly or bi-weekly sprint process, and the goal, usually you have an engineer who is like your like lead and like who's organizing the rest of the team, who's working together with a product manager and a data scientist like I am. And the goal is to track like actual product metrics so that when you are developing like additional products, you make sure that you're optimizing for usage on your platform. There's multiple ways that you can track stuff like that. You can either have like an in-house platform that tracks usage metrics for like different like product funnels. You can use things like either Google Analytics or Mixpanel as well that kind of like looks at user interactions with your platform or the product that you have. And I'm going to get into this a little bit when we go through like my presentation in like a little bit, but there's a component here called A/B testing that I think is like kind of important, which is once you've developed a new product feature or like a change inside of your funnel, instead of just like throwing that into like the general like product population or like the people that are utilizing your platform, you want to have like a holdout group. So this is people who don't actually see the new thing that you've developed, and you want to compare the metrics between the two to make sure you've actually improved what you were trying to improve. This is kind of like where statistics and like you know a little bit more complex mathematics kind of goes into it. But the goal here is you're not doing it purely like on vibes, you know, like this isn't just like based on your feeling, it's based on what you're actually observing from your users so that you can incorporate the change.
Yeah. Well, the very last question before I leave you with your presentation. I saw the slides. They're extremely cool, so guys. Folks, I recommend you to stay here in live and listen to us. So, if you mentioned that I'm a startup and I use in Asana or any other tool, it doesn't matter. But which three most important product metrics you will recommend me to account, even if I don't like to?
That's totally fair. Yeah. So I think like it depending on your product platform, you will have different like product metrics that are the most important for you. And I think what you need to do when you're starting up your development process is to define a North Star metric. So if I'm, for example, some kind of a social media platform, early on, if something that would be extremely important for me would be customer acquisition, so signups, right? But then if I'm a different type of platform, maybe I'm something like a video sharing platform, then the most important North Star metric for me would actually be the number of people that are like watching or clicks and engagement, right? So we're going to get into that in like a little bit as well, but three types of metrics that I think like everybody should try to kind of define as they're developing their product. One is the North Star. This is what you're optimizing for. One is the guardrail metric. This is like your metric like revenue or retention and stuff like that. These are things that you don't want to harm. And then the last one are general usage learning metrics. So these are metrics that you're observing on the day-to-day, and you're kind of using that to figure out what you want to develop further inside of your product. But yeah, I think I'll get into that a little bit more in like a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, sounds awesome. So I think it's a very right point to start with your presentation. So Azraf Anwar at LXTHON, let's make it.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. All right. Yeah. So I think like the starting point that I kind of want to impress on everybody is that we're going to be talking about what it means to use data in terms of like informing your product development process. There's two parts of this that I think are like kind of important. So one part of it is when you're a more mature company, and the other part of it is when you're like a startup where you're iterating from like a younger, like, you know, like from like a younger company age perspective, right? So a lot of products actually just generally fail, unfortunately, inside of like the like the startup slash company development process. Up to 85% of new products inside of the United States fail each year, and it's often because of like a poor PDLC process or a product development lifecycle process before the actual launch happened, right? So as we talked about earlier with Daniil, SDLC, or software development, is like a component of the greater product development lifecycle. So I'm going to get into the PDLC component first, and then we're going to talk about SDLC a little bit more. So PDLC really starts with kind of like understanding a structured approach towards product commercialization. I think a thing that I've often seen with like startup founders, or at least folks that I've worked with here in New York, is that often commercialization starts with somebody having like a really good, strong technical idea. But because these are people who are from like an overtly technical background, they have a harder time understanding monetization or execution. And this is where PDLC kind of helps. So PDLC you can use a number of established frameworks like new product development or the IDEO framework, or just like lean startup. These are all things that we'll go into in future slides. But what matters is actually forming an opinion in terms of market research and product market fit before you jump straight into like the execution process. And then once you've completed initial execution with an MVP or a minimum viable product, you want to iterate on it. This involves like actual extensive user testing. So you want to try to get like a product partner or somebody on the field who's agreed to test run your product and is actually working with you to develop like proper product market fit, so you can then expand outwards and get more and more clients, right? So let's start off with the first part. The most important part, obviously, of developing a startup is starting up. And that involves generating actual ideas and then figuring out the viability of what you're actually trying to develop. In this part of the PDLC process, I would invite most people to be just generally open-ended in terms of like the approach they're taking to different solutions. It might be the case that there are some hot new technologies available in like the space that you kind of want to implement and like put on top of a solution. But I think inside of the brainstorming session, you should really try to be kind of open-ended with your co-founders. During this period, it usually is the most beneficial if you have a diverse set of co-founders, right? It's if you have somebody who is like a little bit more technically talented, but then also somebody who is like a little bit more talented on like the financial side or maybe the market research side, working together to actually figure out proper industries that you might want to enter is pretty good. A big thing right now, I think like this is like probably clear for anybody who's inside of like the software space, is the utilization of LLMs and like different artificial intelligence models, right? So when you're thinking about developing a new startup, you might identify a novel new technology that you're interested in executing, and then look at different industries that you think are ripe for disruption. And this is where viability research really comes into it, right? This involves looking at actual industry trends, targeting market needs as you've identified it. And then I think this part is like usually a little bit, unfortunately, like missing from a few startup founders that I've worked with in the past, figuring out customer demographics and competition, right? So I think I'm going to provide like a little bit of like an anecdotal thing here, but one of like the founders that I've like kind of like chatted with / worked with in the last couple of years developed a novel like product that involved segmenting different file systems inside of your computer network, and then kind of sprawling them out, so that you flatten the file system inside of your computer from like the general like Windows-based file system to a flattened 2D sprawl. The idea here was to let artists and people who work with photographs visualize as many of their photographs and artworks as possible. And this actually was like a really, really cool product, right? The idea was if you were running into issues where you're losing track of the number of files that you have inside of your computer and you lose old images and artwork that you've worked in the past, this will make it easier to identify that. When they initially tried to monetize this, though, they didn't do proper customer demographic research. And so they tried to sell it to artists and photographers who were freelance, but these were not people who could really generate revenue for them, right? And ultimately, this kind of became like a lag in their initial funding because they couldn't figure out a proper path towards monetization. And it was only later that they figured out that, oh, this is actually something that can also be sold to like different online markets or online e-commerce platforms who might try to create galleries of their products, right? So when we're talking about customer demographics, I think an important consideration is a little bit into that product market fit. And this is kind of like goes into that viability research. Let's say you've done this, you've identified the idea that you want, you figured out viability, and you think that you've got something that can be a good fit. What kind of goes next in terms of like the foundations of success? A few different things that you kind of want to dive into a little bit more, right? You've done initial viability research, you've done initial idea generation. So now let's go a little bit deeper into each of those individual components that would make your research further, like a further success. So when we talk about industry trends and forecasts, I think this is something that I think is like often a little bit more geared towards a co-founder who is on like maybe like the financial or like technical, like commercial execution side. But I think what I'm trying to nudge folks towards here is actually looking at other competitors in the space and not operating purely on the assumption that the product that they're developing is something that won't be subsumed by competitors in the field. So this is kind of like another kind of building on the example from earlier. Other companies that were more mature in the space, unfortunately, had also kind of considered development of the product that this, this co-founder had considered. And so if you have a large competitor like Adobe, who's inside of the space and is already kind of established, building on top of the product that you've kind of developed, you're obviously going to get kind of squeezed out of the market, right? And so this is where each of the individual components of like research kind of becomes extremely important. I would nudge everybody to do proper industry analysis and to really think about the competitors that they have within the space and whether or not disruption is truly possible. And this usually involves identifying whether or not these competitors have identifiable gaps. And honestly, for a lot of established competitors, it might actually be as easy as reaching out to people who are utilizing those products and seeing if there's a sufficient pain point in terms of like their product usage that you think your new product and the way that you're developing it could fit into that gap, right? All of these different four components that I have here, industry analysis, marketing, like target market exploration, customer demographics, and competitive analysis, all kind of work in tandem to kind of inform that decision. And I think like it's a very, very core component of that initial setup for success. Once you have all these things, you've kind of like developed that backbone to support like the product. This is a little bit where I would again invite technical members of your founding team to work with like a very good designer. So just kind of like running it back, we've identified the need for somebody with strong technical execution during the ideation phase. We've identified the need for somebody with very good research / like more of like a market commercialization execution during the research phase. And now a little bit more on the UX design side. I think when you're thinking about how to create and bring to life the value proposition that you have for your startup, it's important to work with somebody who's a little bit better on the design side before you just kind of like, bring something straight to market. So this is kind of a tandem development process in my mind. As you're going through this component of like the PDLC cycle, you're working both with your design partner and with your technical execution partner to develop a series of prototypes. And these prototypes should ideally be released out to potential users so that you can continually test and iterate on the prototype. We talked about this a little bit earlier with Daniil, but a way that a mature company basically does something like this is through the SDLC, or the software development lifecycle, with something that we call A/B testing. If you're a mature company, you have the benefit of having a large number of established users, and you can release small adjustments or increments to your product inside of like those weekly or bi-weekly sprints. And over the course of a sprint, you have a holdout group or users who don't have experience with a new change in the prototype, whereas you have some folks who do have experience with like the new change in the prototype, and you can statistically measure differences in terms of the actual product metrics that you care about between these two groups. The product metrics are what I had mentioned earlier in terms of both the North Star metric, or the thing that you're trying to optimize for, the guardrail metric, or the thing that you cannot harm no matter what, and then finally those learning metrics in terms of like local utilization of like the actual product, right? So what do each of these things mean? I'm gonna get a little bit granular here. And I am gonna like have space for like Q&A with like I think Daniil and other folk after the presentation is over. So please do like feel free to come back to this part if you guys are curious. But when we talk about the North Star metric, depending on the product space that you have, this should ideally be something that funnels towards whatever mission statement or execution statement you have for your product. If I were a social media platform like Facebook or Meta or something like that, for example, what's the most important for me is continued user engagement. So the number of weekly active users that are on my platform is very important for me. And this would be something that I would measure as a North Star metric instead of like these A/B tests, right? At the same time, though, I'm a commercial entity. So I'm somebody who wants money, right? And so ad revenue or like the recurring revenue that I generate from my platform is not something that I want to compromise. So this would be my guardrail metric. This is something that inside of any of my new changes, I want to make sure I'm not harming. I might also, as a product development partner, be interested in how the specific utilization of different components of my platform changes as a consequence of the new change that I introduced. So because I made a new way to view videos inside of the feed or something like that, I now care about how that impacts the amount of chats that a user might introduce. These types of local metrics fall into the learning metric bucket that I mentioned earlier. So these are the core three component of the metric bucket that you want to kind of compare whenever you've developed a new prototype or an incremental improvement and you want to compare the different like types of releases that you have. But I mentioned earlier that this is kind of the case for a lot of mature companies, right? It's like very easy for a mature company to do this because they usually have like an established user base. So then how is a startup supposed to kind of like operate within that space? How does a startup actually, iteratively develop their prototypes? This is kind of where the idea of an established product partner is really beneficial to like a lot of startup co-founders. So I think what I'm trying to say here is if you can find that first client that is willing to be a development partner or a first series of users that are willing to be development partners for you, you can kind of build on that to develop what I would call qualitative data points for prototyping. And this involves fast release cycles where you're making incremental changes and then you're checking in as soon as you can with these additional development partners in the form of like your first client or your first set of users in order to gather feedback on your product iteratively, right? So the way that you would do something like this, there's like a number of different tools that are available from Google Analytics all the way out to Mixpanel and stuff like that, is up to you. But generally speaking, the importance of qualitative feedback is very important when you're inside of that early startup phase. And then as you develop more and more users and you start having more and more people on board onto your platform, you start going from 10 users to 50 to 100, that's when you shift a little bit more towards that A/B testing space, where now that you have the numbers, you can statistically compare the value proposition from like different prototypes you have inside of your SDLC cycle. You're now past that initial prototyping and you've kind of created that 1.0 MVP that you want to release, right? So this is like where I think like the importance of like that initial commercialization or monetization execution partner kind of comes into play again. This is where you're now at launch day and you're thinking really about like whether or not you're going to be successful. Pre-marketing your releases is like extremely important. And interestingly enough, marketing is also something that you can kind of A/B test on, and is something that you can leverage a lot of like the strategies that we developed, like discussed earlier. In terms of the designing process falls into it. So how would that happen? You can basically iterate on your different marketing / commercialization strategies by looking at the engagement metrics that come back to you based on whatever advertisement campaign or based on whatever outreach campaign you have inside of your platform, right? So the way that you collect data and information here is not just limited to those software interactions, but is also actually in terms of successful conversion events that you have inside of your marketing interactions before your launch day, right? Let's say that I'm launching some kind of a new chatbot or something like that, and I want as many of the people as possible inside of like some kind of a university platform or university campus to use it, and I'm utilizing different advertisement avenues, either Google Chat's ad services or Facebook's ad services, or maybe Instagram's ad services. Each of these services will offer analytics to you in terms of user engagement with the actual ad posts that you've presented and the marketing platforms that you've presented. And you can collect this information back and adjust your marketing schema or your marketing, proposal in an appropriate way that maximizes engagement with what you're actually releasing. So this is like another way in which you can kind of like optimize for success before launch day. Generally speaking, I would suggest doing this if you have sufficient budgets for this. So this is like if you've like raised enough to support this type of like an in-depth marketing campaign before launch day. This could be a very, very big, marker towards success. I would say that if you're operating more from like a lean model, customer acquisition would be kind of like falling into a similar iterative, qualitative to quantitative model that I discussed earlier for startups to a mature company. So again, two paths here, depending on what kind of budget considerations you have for like pre-launch marketing, but both of them pretty straightforward in my opinion, and making sure you do them before the actual launch day does make or break in terms of like that success, right? Okay. Earlier when we were talking about PDLC strategies and frameworks, I mentioned that there are a number of pre-established frameworks that you can kind of follow. New product development or stage gate is one of them. The IDEO process is another one, and then the final one is that lean startup process that I've kind of written out here. In terms of the framework that you use, I think it's important to kind of test with the team that you've gathered which framework works best for everybody's like work style. I think like if trying to fit a framework onto a team where they don't necessarily resonate with the design process is not going to be conducive for success. I will say, however, I personally have kind of like a leaning towards that lean startup process where you're kind of emphasizing experimentation and kind of building, measuring, building, measuring, building, measuring to go from an idea into like an MVP is usually very, very good if you're constrained on budget. So if the amount of money and the amount of like starting capital you have for your startup is like a little bit more like on the limited side. If you're a little bit more established in terms of like the funding that you have, I think a combination of StageGate and IDEO would be pretty good too. But once again, I think this really kind of depends on the scale and scope of your operation. But yeah, I think like key takeaways that I want everybody to hopefully take away from like what I've just discussed. That early validation and research is important, and your cross-functional partners are very important for people who are more technically oriented. So you want like a diverse set of backgrounds on your team. I understand that there's a lot of people out there who are like, no, technical only. I will say, I think if you just have a million technical people, it's usually a little bit harder to monetize. So just putting that out there. The second part, I think, is iteration is quite important as well. And this involves working with this, like either a product partner in order to kind of like gather qualitative feedback and iterate, or kind of going more into that A/B testing loop if you're a more established company. And then finally, choosing like that kind of like right PDLC framework to help your team out, depending on how folks are on your team, is pretty important as well. But yeah, PDLC also does not really end at launch. You want to make sure that you're continuing to gather sales, customer marketing, research after you've gotten that MVP 0 out and iterating as well. And the process for doing that is about the same as what I discussed already. It's all iterative. You're continuing to gather those kinds of like usage data, and you're continuing to iterate based on the metrics that you've predefined. Yeah, that's all for me. I'm going to pause here in case there are any questions that folks can go through. Daniil, I think you might be muted.
Yeah,
there we go.
That's true. Azraf, thank you very much for such a comprehensive speech. I just would like to ask our producer if we have any questions on the YouTube, because I may not see it in real time. But from my side, I think I have a small set of questions we for sure should discuss. And yeah, so no questions for now, but to be honest, everyone is open to ask the questions. So regarding your journey in this, can I call it data-driven decisioning to be short, or it's something different?
Data-driven, yeah, that's totally fine. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So to be honest, on my LinkedIn page, like on a banner, I posted a thing that I call data-driven and storytelling decisioning. So, like, I mean, that's not everything can be counted with the data. Sometimes we need stories from people to respect their wish and so on. So, I just wanted to know, like, how do you see, how do you approach the things that are incountable from the first glance? Uh, are you willing to count them, or do you also love some kind of storytelling instead of metrics?
No, that's a great question. So I think when it comes down to data-driven storytelling, a thing that I would all honestly like invite most people to consider is that things that you think are uncountable actually do end up being countable. So what I mean by that is you start from the question that your product partner has. So for example, somebody comes to you and they say, "Hey, I want to know I want to know whether or not my new UX interface, my new UI interface is actually improving the amount of money that I get." And you think to yourself, oh, all you've made is a change in a button. How am I supposed to measure whether or not one button UI UX change has actually improved ARR or revenue for your company? Well, the answer is you can actually break down components of the funnel. So number of people logging in, number of people seeing that new change that you've implemented, the number of people that are actually clicking into it, and utilizing like an analytics tool, either like, maybe let's say Google Analytics or something like a Mixpanel, you can break down interactions with each part of that funnel. And by looking at that, you can statistically then compare between the two sides, right? You then link that back to the product. So you now have more data, you have more information. You can link that back to the product storytelling that you want to do, where you're like, hey, I'm a product development team. I implemented this UI UX change, and you told me you wanted to know whether or not this actually had measurable improvement inside of like the money I'm bringing the company. Well, yes, we do. And the reason that we do is because we know from each part of this component or each part of this funnel, we've improved actual user engagement and clicks. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. And I think that actually one more question on my side is that we are like it was always very complicated to distinguish like data scientists between machine learning specialists. Like I would say 10 years ago, it was literally the same because there were no deep machine learning and machine learning was really the pure data science. But nowadays, we like 2 years ago, we entered the era of large language models that are now converted to the agentic. I feel soon it's going to become a general AI and so on and so on. And my question is that what do you think about making the stories accounted? Because nowadays, the art of data scientist is to find the countable relations, things that we may convert to numbers like embeddings for words, yeah, and so on. But don't you feel like it's becoming easy peasy now?
Yeah, a little bit. But I think like that's like the beauty of like new technologies and releases, right? So I think like I there are a lot of people who like talk about this, I think, like on like general media. So people from like A16Z all the way to Andreessen Horowitz, right? So like I would say things becoming easier means more people can do it efficiently. So you can think of this as like tools that are unlocking / making your job easier, and therefore more people can efficiently engage in data science. So if anything, the suggestion that I would have for most people to consider is now you have all these tools available, so you should start integrating it into your product development cycle, into your startup cycle, right? Because the costs are only going to go down. The cost of implementing all these changes are only going to go down. So why not try to make your development process more efficient? To your earlier question, in terms of like differentiating like what like a data scientist is and all that kind of stuff, a data scientist, I'd say, wears multiple different hats. So they're doing all like the data engineering and like, LLM / science-based components that you mentioned, but they're also helping out inside of that product development cycle. So this is kind of like a thing where I think an argument could be made of becoming more of a trained full stack data scientist, where you're kind of doing all parts of that. And as you'd mentioned, we have all these tools now. It's easier to do these things. So why not become better at the end-to-end process? Yeah.
This extremely sorrowful, to be honest. I mean that, okay, let's make the questions this way. So, how do you think? What's the bigger problem nowadays on the market? Like more companies that's over focusing on metrics, or companies over focusing on stories? For
That's a
me,
good
like
question.
it's obvious.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. Well, actually, like, why don't I throw that question back to you first? I'm curious what you think, and then
Yeah,
I can.
I think that we are like struggling of a dramatical number of companies that don't count anything.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I think it's probably depends on the life cycle of the company. And so what I mean by that is we kind of got into it during my presentation, but when you're a startup, the story and the qualitative feedback matters more because you don't have the raw numbers, right? So the metrics and the counting becomes very important when you have enough people to do that kind of statistical A/B testing. So early on, you're going to be working with those product partners or development partners where you're going to be iterating based on that qualitative feedback that you receive. But it's very important to realize that when you hit a point of maturation, when you hit a point where you have hundreds of users and there are too many people for you to be interviewing and keeping everybody happy at the same time, that's when that A/B testing and that statistical testing becomes very important. So that's when you start measuring to actually make sure that it's not just based on vibes, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And how do you think from starting what headcount companies must to account metrics?
That's a good question. I'd say when you hit I would do it based on revenue and customer maturity. So when you start entering a space where you have larger enterprise clients, it's like a must that you should start doing A/B testing. When you're in a space where you're maybe selling to one or two users, maybe 10, 15 users, and they're all a little bit smaller fish, not as important, right? But when you get to that enterprise level and you have revenue maturity, must. Yeah.
Totally agree with you. And yeah, Azraf, it was an extreme pleasure to have you here at LXTHON. Thank you so much for noticing us. And I think that actually we're heading our second checkpoint. We wish you a great teams because you are an expert at our hackathon. And for sure, we wish you a great career in a data scientist. And so let's keep connected. Even after checkpoint, tomorrow you participate as jury and join us online for round table for other discussions. Unfortunately, dry surf lesson is not so accessible online yet. But anyways, thank you very much for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. Take care.
Thank you very much.